My name is Kimberly Blair. I am the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy here at NAMI-NYC. We stand for the National Alliance on Mental Illness of New York City. We're based on 38th Street by 8th Avenue. Come check us out if you haven't already. And I will be one of your moderators for tonight. As I briefly mentioned before, I am joined today by a co-moderator, Alexandra Nyman. Alexandra Nyman is one of the co-chairs of our dual diagnosis subcommittee and an advocacy ambassador with NAMI-NYC. She also is the founder and SEO of Break Free Foundation, which provides scholarships for individuals to attend inpatient and outpatient rehabilitation programs. Among this and all these other things, Alexandra Nyman is also a great fashion designer. So definitely check out her periodic Break Free New York Fashion Week sets. I had the pleasure of attending one just a few months ago, and I was just stunned and wowed. So without further ado, let's actually get in the chat for folks to please just let us know where you're coming from. Let us know what borough you're in, just so that the speakers can get some sort of spatial, regional. There we go, we got Staten Island. Keep them coming in. The Bronx, all right. Brooklyn, Manhattan. Oh, well, now we have everything. Where's Queens? Where's Queens? Don't tell me that we don't have representation from Queens. Okay, so I'm gonna let y'all figure that out. Go call your cousins in Queens to come to, oh, I live in NYC, Upper West Side, but I'm in Florida right now. Thank you for joining us from Florida. Well, some ground rules, irrespective of where you're joining us from tonight, we want to make sure that this is a safe space. It's very, very vulnerable to talk about some of these topics that we bring up in the town halls. And some people are going to be sharing their lived experiences, not just on the panel, but also in the chat as well. So some ground rules are, this is a hot button issue. Emotions will run high. We want you to approach this conversation on harm reduction with an open and clear mind, no matter where you're at. If you yourself identify, we still want you to be respectful of other people's experiences because they might not be the same. And if you don't live with a co-occurring substance use disorder, but you are part of our mental health community, we do want you to just be open to people's experiences and try to be an ally as much as you can during this space, because it is hard to share, again, some of these things. And some people will be sharing questions in the chat. We're gonna have Caitlin, who's gonna be screening questions. And if we have time, we'll take a couple at the end. So there are multiple pathways to and through recovery. And we're gonna be talking a lot about harm reduction, and concepts of overdose prevention. If you have a question and you would like to ask, again, use the chat. We have muted everyone except for the panelists today, just so that we can be considerate of any background noises. And if you do have any issues with the Zoom itself or any tech, you can directly message Caitlin Garbo, who is our manager of public policy and advocacy. She's on the line. She just raised her hand so that you know who she is. Or you can try to even message me, but Caitlin should be your first contact. And she will mark questions again to be answered by our panel if we have time. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton over to Alexandra Nyman, and we're gonna begin the substantive part of today's discussion. Alexandra?
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everybody. The purpose of tonight's town hall is to address common myths of what dual diagnosis is and to educate everyone on the Safer Consumption Services Act, which is Senate Bill 399A and Assembly Bill 338 in the New York State Legislature, and how it can benefit those with co-occurring disorders and with mental health disorders. We may be throwing around terms that you do not recognize, so we will take this time now to define them. Dual diagnosis or co-occurring disorder is an individual who has both a mental health disorder and a substance use or alcohol misuse disorder. Harm reduction is used to decrease the negative consequences of recreational drug use without requiring abstinence, requiring that those unable to stop these risky behaviors can still make positive changes to protect themselves and others. Tonight, we are joined by Stephen Gray, who works as the Drug Policy Campaign Coordinator at Vocal New York and supports the Safer Consumption Services Act. Grace Ortiz, who is a member organizer with the Institute for the Development of Human Arts, works at the Legal Action Center, and is an advocate with Freedom Agenda for people who are facing incarceration and their loved ones. Queen Adesuyi, who is the policy strategist for state and local government affairs at Color of Change, and Joshua Sewell, who serves as the regional manager at the Recovery Centers of America, which is one of the nation's only co-occurring disorder recovery centers. I'll now pass it over to Kim for our first question of the night.
Thank you so much, Alex. So first, let's just dive into why is this work so important to you all? Why did you get involved in this field supporting people living with dual diagnosis? I'm going to begin with Joshua.
Thank you, Kimberly. So addiction has been a part of my life since birth. I came into this world into an addicted family. That continued all the way up until high school, where my own addiction set in, began as alcohol, moved to different substances from there. By the time I turned 18, I have been in recovery for 12 years myself. My mother, still to this day, suffers from mental health diagnoses. She was diagnosed starting in 1997. So I've really had a full continuum through family and through my own personal lived experiences, that in 2012, I made a goal to myself that I was gonna, and at the time I was living in New Orleans, I was gonna help my community. And then relocated to New York City in 2018. I've continued my work and serve as a treatment advocate in my community every day, and feel grateful and fortunate to be able to help people that suffer from both co-occurring substance use and mental health.
Thank you so much, Joshua. And thank you also for just opening up and sharing a piece of your story with us. That's really what we're here to make sure that many people don't feel alone on this call, so that they know that we are also among the community members as well. So also, now I'm going to pass it on to Grace. Same question. Why is this work important to you? Why did you get involved in this field?
Hi, everybody. And thank you, Kimberly, for inviting me here. I'm really excited about it. And y'all know Kimberly is just like such a queen advocate. It's amazing to be in her energy. And, you know, just I'm grateful that she's someone, you know, at the helm, and that we have her in this fight. My name is Grace, she, her pronouns. I come from similar, you know, I appreciate how Joshua spoke to his like roots in this, and I can definitely speak to that as well as others I'm sure can too. In regards to co-occurring disorders, that is something really close to my heart because of my own like genetic predisposition. In addition to like compounded by like early infancy to teenage years trauma, like I just had a childhood that was like particularly painful and complex, and just something where trauma was not, I didn't get a, you know, life before that. I don't know what that looks like. Again, I was genetically predisposed because of addiction that was in my family and that I saw all around. And, you know, because of the trauma that my family members endured over multiple generations. And, you know, it's just like there wasn't resources for healing. It's hard to, you know, escape those circumstances, and people just need to do what they have to do to survive and take care of themselves. You know, there's not a lot of space given for and the resources and the grace and mercy to like heal. So of course people turn to substances. And again, compounded by trauma, it just became kind of an inevitability. And something that, you know, has been a huge fight of mine, and the necessity to break the stigma so that people understand that, you know, addiction doesn't happen in a vacuum. Addiction is a result of a lack of resources, unfortunate, you know, genetic predispositions again, and just a general struggle. And that needs to be the way that we speak to that and those impacted by it first and foremost. So my own personal experience arises is the root of this, but also where I come from. I'm from the Bronx, and the majority of my friends have experienced incarceration. So that's a fight that I'm in very much so. And mental health and mental illness, substance use disorder are all things, these intersections that they're no coincidence. And we need to treat people in a holistic community, understanding the soil that they come from.
Thank you so much, Grace. And just because you mentioned the Bronx, I'm gonna do some BX representation here. That's right. So we're gonna go next to my colleague, Queen. Queen, I'm so happy to have you on here.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, everyone on the panel. I'm really, really excited to be here and thankful to be here. My name is Queen Adesui. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also from the Bronx. I'm a policy strategist with the Color of Change, but I actually just left the Drug Policy Alliance, where I was there for 7 years, doing a lot of this work as well. And, you know, what brought me to this work is also my personal experiences, both as a person who uses drugs and a person who is a child of generational trauma, and a child of mental illness. So for me, what really, really, truly kind of cemented the fact that this is my life's work was recognizing that people who use drugs are not treated the same way depending on who they are and where they are. And I didn't really recognize that fully until I left the Bronx, and I had the privilege of being able to go to Georgetown on a full ride, where actually I met Kim, and noticing how people who use drugs back home in the Bronx and how people who use drugs on campus and even just in the Georgetown area was completely different. And people's outcomes were different because of that. So for me, I'm here in this work, namely to hold our government accountable to the ways that our policies worsen people's health outcomes, separate from whatever issues they may be dealing with. Our policies, especially the war on drugs, is a huge part of why people are suffering needlessly. So for me, you know, as an advocate, a policy advocate, and as a person with lived experiences, it's important for myself and others like us to be in the room to make sure that we are mitigating the harms that are coming really from the policies that make life way too difficult for no reason, and oftentimes ignore the realities that people are facing. And one thing that I want to leave folks with before I pass the mic is that I really do believe that we could mitigate harm if we actually treat people like people, and like was mentioned before, if we actually address stigma, we can actually, you know, fight for a world where people don't need to escape from, and provide people with the resources that they may need to get healthier. So that's kind of what brought me to the work, and that's what sustained me in this work. And I'll pass it back to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Queen, and thank you for sharing that, your personal lived experience. And now I'm going to pass it to also a colleague in this fight, Stephen Gray from Vocal. Stephen.
Good evening, everyone. Again, thank you so much for having me. My name is Stephen. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. And much to all of my other colleagues' kind of responses, I have my own personal experiences that has drawn me to the work, that has exposed me to the realities of living with dual diagnoses, to be living in a society that is a consequence of the failed war on drug era. You know, I grew up in South Brooklyn, Coney Island, and that was not something that was excluded from my life, right? And what has always grounded me in the work is, simply put, people are dying, right? outside of everything else, outside of the policy, outside of everything else, people are dying. Black, brown, poor people are dying. And these are a group of people that has been largely ignored for decades, right? Intentionally so, right? And that is what draws me to the work. And at Focal New York, I am the drug policy campaign coordinator. So I build out campaigns, I mobilize members, people from the community, drug users, current and former, to build power, to build momentum, to really change the tide in the failed war on drug era and the current overdose crisis that we're living in right now. And having what we're going to talk about later, a harm reductionist approach to it all. And I think, Queen, you put it quite beautifully that at the end of the day, these are people, right? And we're fighting for people, right? And that's what continues to draw me into this work.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Alexandra, who's going to ask the next question. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you everybody for sharing. Now, how does the concept of harm reduction help community members specifically living with dual diagnosis? Joshua, what do you think?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for me, and I'm sure all my lovely colleagues will be able to expand upon it, it's really creating a safe environment and getting a foot in the door, right? So in my line as a treatment advocate, right, my core function with Recovery Centers America is to help people to safely get into treatment, co-occurring dual diagnosis with substance use, detox, and rehab. And so one of the jokes I say is there'll be patients that do not want to admit, right? They're very hesitant. They're like, oh, my wife wants me to go, but I don't want to go to treatment. And I kind of make the joke, like, some tox is better than no tox. I'm looking for them just to come and start, because without the start, we're nowhere. And so I really kind of use that analogy with harm reduction. It is to mitigate risky behavior. It doesn't encourage to go do more of this, but it is acknowledging that this is a reality of our world. It's going to happen, right? And then how can we best serve our communities to reduce or even to encourage maybe down the road to where we do get into a place of abstinence or recovery. But that's for a lot of people in a realistic, and especially at the population level, it's not realistic to say, well, everybody's just going to be abstinent, it's going to work. And they're going to go to meetings and recovery and they're going to do IOP groups and they're just not going to ever use drugs or alcohol again. I think it's also especially prevalent with our younger populations. It's hard for an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid in college to say, I'm never going to drink or use substances again, right? So we have to meet them where they're at. I think clinically, I think at societal level, community level, we have to be able to open our spaces to wherever they're at and work from there instead of them meeting us where we're at. So I would start with that.
Thank you. And I agree, it can be discouraging after going to rehab and just realizing just because I went, that doesn't mean that I'm cured. Your journey still continues. Queen, what can you add to the discussion?
I think one thing that's really beautiful about harm reduction is that it's a spectrum and it's inclusive of everyone, which is the opposite of kind of the status quo, which often wants to force people into abstinence immediately, or and I think that environment makes it harder for people to thrive in at all. One example of how I like to describe harm reduction outside of the drug space is around driving. So for example, like, driving is a very dangerous thing. We don't ban driving because there have been accidents. So in the same way that, like, we shouldn't look to just ban drugs because of the harms associated with its use, harm reduction allows us to really see the potential of what it looks like to reduce harms across whatever issue. Really, it was born in the drug space, but it's something that can apply to your life in general, really, and it's something that I live by. Like, harm reduction is in and out of my life throughout. So the driving example, instead of banning cars, we institute things like seatbelt requirements, speed limits, and inspections of cars and things like that. Like, we institute policies to make driving safer, acknowledging that driving is kind of necessary or it's important. And when you think about it in the context of drugs and drug use, again, another thing that our government fails to acknowledge is that there are people who find benefits in drug use. There's a lot in that space around autonomy and pleasure and joy and community that sometimes, and a lot of times, drug use brings for people. There are ways for us to reduce the harms of drug use without forcing people into sobriety or forcing people into abstinence, and that also dignify people. And harm reduction, you know, for the decades and decades that it has been instituted, whether formally or not, because harm reduction wasn't always a thing that our president would ever say. It's something that has always happened underground in order to protect people, absent, you know, laws in terms of protecting people. But harm reduction, especially for people who have co-occurring issues, like was mentioned, is an entry into different possibilities. But again, it's really about humanizing people, meeting people where they are in terms of what they may actually need, which may or may not be even related to their drug use. Sometimes a person who may be struggling with addiction, their first priority actually is getting housing. Talking to people about what they actually need is harm reduction. So harm reduction, of course, is, you know, sterile supplies, access to treatment, things that are, you know, I think are very apparent in terms of like drug-related harm reduction things. But again, like I mentioned, getting people regular access to nutritious food, childcare, housing, you know, access to like viable employment that actually pays people a living wage. All of those things are harm reduction. And our policies, because they're so focused on people's drug use and moralizing people in terms of their drug use or not, ignores the systemic reasons why most people are actually really struggling, and ignores people's co-occurring issues and the fact that we have horrible, you know, access to trauma-informed care, horrible access to healthcare in general. So for me, you know, I believe that harm reduction is critical, and it's really the only way for us to really reduce the harms of drug use and overdose, or the risk of overdose, and also allow for people to go through their own personal journeys in a way that's dignifying, and is true to themselves and true to like their own experiences.
Thank you for that. I really love your analogy of equating it to driving as a risky behavior. I think that's very easy to grasp for our audience members who are here with us today. Stephen, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, totally. And I just want to uplift what both Joshua and Queen have kind of cemented, which is really meeting people where they're at, right? The principle of understanding the complexities of each and every person, the complexities of their own lived experience. And I think when you begin to do that, you also begin to understand their autonomy, right? That at the end of the day, they are autonomous people. And that is how you approach, you know, people with trauma-informed care, with really meeting the community where they're at. You know, drugs have been used for thousands of years, right? But what we know and what we have seen in the failed war on drug era was that criminalizing folks, throwing folks in jail for drug usage or sale or possession does not do anything to deter their drug use. It doesn't do anything to support them living with a dual diagnoses, right? But what does is being able to offer, to Queen's point, members of support, a system, an infrastructure, so that people can continue to use, but also having access to roundabout services that can actually promote their own healthcare when they choose to.
Now, before we go to Grace, Stephen, this is the second time that you've mentioned the war on drugs. Could you just briefly, in 30 seconds or less, explain what that is?
Yeah, totally. The modern war on drug era refers to the set of policies that have been enacted from President Nixon on that really centered criminalizing drug usage, sale, and possession. And because of those policies, we saw the hyper increase in incarceration and overdoses nationally. So because of that, we are currently living in a modern day overdose crisis.
Thank you so much for breaking that down for everybody that's here tonight. And Grace, how does the concept harm reduction help community members specifically living with dual diagnosis?
Yes to everything that's been said already. Amazing. And I wanted to say, you know, in speaking to the space that I'm in, with the people that I'm in, anyone and everyone impacted by mental health challenges, mental illness, whether personally or through your loved ones, however you choose to, you know, what brought you to this room, you need to unequivocally be in support of people with addiction. And I'm just going to say it as blatantly as that, and I'll tell you why. Because you should know better than anyone what it's like to be told, because of how you show up for the day, whether it's depression, anxiety, bipolar disorders, personality, and mood disorders. And we've all had moments in which that created discomfort for someone who didn't know how to hold space for us, right? Whether growing up, caregivers, teachers, friends, in which we had to make ourselves smaller because of our suffering, because it made people uncomfortable. So for all the moments that you were told when you were depressed, just cheer up, smile. When you're anxious, just relax, chill out. You know, when people spoke to you in such a way as if it was just that easy of a choice. I understand the stigma of drugs and drug users, but we need to empathize and show up for each other in that exact same way, because the differences are very few, and the Venn diagram between people who have mental health diagnoses and those who suffer with substance use disorder is just right there with each other. So why create that separation? Why create that stigma between each other? Because the same people that stigmatize you for having some kind of mental health need are the same people that stigmatize those who are drug users. They're not on your side. And ultimately, harm reduction saves lives, period. Just like when someone might tell you have to try this treatment for your depression, try that drug, try this, and just strip you of your autonomy. A lot of you might know what that feels like, how dehumanizing, and how it yanks you of any sense of control and say, because people are pasting some kind of outward solution onto your life. Right? Regardless of, you might say, hey, this and that medication, like, I don't like the way it feels, but people want you to obey a certain way of doing things, right? And you might not feel like that is parallel to what drug users experience, you know, but you have to, when you think of the drug user that, you know, you might kind of see negative portrayals of, right? Someone shooting up on the street, you know, in really bad condition, and a judgment that people pass on to them very often and quickly is like, you know, why are you doing things that hurt you? And I'm here to break it to you. Like, if you might know this if you already are a drug user or are in, you know, community with those who are, but like, nobody hurts themselves because they want to. You know, there's a serious chemical scientific component in the way that drugs and drug addiction impacts the brain that needs to be addressed. And it's a really quick spiral to fall into. And in a country in which drugs through medications, through insurance are so hard to access, all kinds of treatment are so hard to access, why are we surprised that we have such an issue with people using substances that are harmful? And why are we stigmatizing them for doing what they can to have access to? And given that these substances have a chemical component that habituates their brain to their what they do, why are we stigmatizing them for falling into that need when it's just it's a completely circumstantial, completely chemical, and something that people need support for, and beyond just seeing them as a drug user, think about their context. So harm reduction stigmatizing harm reduction stigmatizes survivors, victims. It kills them ultimately. And we should know better than anyone that people deserve to heal at their own pace.
Thank you, Grace. I really love your passion and everybody's passion on this panel for this topic. Kimberly, can you please present the next question?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Alexandra. So this next question is really about overdose prevention centers. Before I actually ask the question, I want to make sure that everybody on the call knows what an overdose prevention center is, or a safer consumption site. Other countries or other cities might call them different things. So I want to make sure that you all, because now you've attended this event, you're going to be so well versed in all of these topics. I just want to make sure everybody coming out here is on the same page. So we have overdose prevention centers, safer consumption sites, safe injection facilities or SIFs, or safer injection sites. These are all synonymous. They're all the same. We are the first in New York City, in the country, but here in New York City, we're the first to have opened safer consumption sites. And since then, it's been like an uphill battle to get funding, to get some of these open in other states, which some of my policy colleagues can touch on a little bit later. But the concept is really promoting this harm reduction and getting people engaged with services. So what they do is people go, and as the name suggests, people go, they use substances in a controlled environment. They're not doing it out in the open, but they do have sometimes they have like little booths depending on the place, and they have different mechanisms for people to ask for help, or some other places will have somebody monitoring you while using. We also have in New York City, which we'll talk about later, a hotline so that nobody has to use alone. This is another form of harm reduction. So it's not just the 2 sites that we have. We do have some more or less formal mechanisms for overdose prevention in New York City as well, the phone and some other sites. So now that you all know what OPCs are, I really want this panel to really dispel some, or just what are some common misconceptions about overdose prevention centers that you would like to dispel or like highlight? I would like anybody to jump in first, because I don't really want to pick on anyone, but I really want to make sure that the audience really understands the concept of overdose prevention centers and common misconceptions that get thrown out there.
I could try to jump in if that's cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Dope. So as far as misconceptions with OPCs, I think it's important to ground a little bit the history of OPCs globally. Overdose prevention centers have existed in more than 67 cities in more than 100 different sites for the past 35 years, right around 37 to date, right? So when it comes to meeting people where they're at, this is not a new concept. You know, the United States in and of itself is pretty late to the game, but the fact that we have 2 of the nation's first here in New York City is really, really important. It's pivotal to shifting that narrative in harm reduction. But with that, the first point of opposition that I kind of bring up in the work that I do is that these OPCs just enable people to use drugs, you know, that folks from the community feel as though it'll just be a shooting gallery for people to use their drugs without supervision. And the fact of the matter is, you know, kind of back to what I was mentioning before, despite the war on drugs, the failed war on drugs, you know, people are still going to use drugs, right? The prohibition of alcohol didn't stop people from drinking, but what we can do is really invest in OPCs and keep people alive another day. And when it even comes into the statistics of the successes of OPCs, not only have the global percentage of people using drug and entering OPC programs have already had access to other treatment programs, but also the ones here in New York City, the vast majority of the participant base there have also had access to other harm reduction programs already, or we're in the process of being connected to them, right? And then even with that, there's also this idea that it increases syringe litter, it decreases public safety of the local communities. And one amazing thing that the two OPCs in Manhattan were able to track was the monthly needle count that they were able to pick up, going from somewhere near 13,000 needles a month within the local vicinity and parks to just right around 1,000 a month. So those are some of the things that that we kind of hear day to day as far as opposition goes. But the reality is that OPCs are doing life-saving work while also connecting people to wraparound services so that they can be connected to support systems when they want to.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And as someone who has lived in East Harlem, where one of the OPCs is open, for those who don't know, they're open in East Harlem and Washington Heights. And then we have informal other harm reduction centers, but they're not actually the certified ones by On Point NYC. Yeah, I have seen firsthand how it has reduced the litter in the parks, and not just that, by the schools, just on the main avenues as well. So I just want to share that little bit of lived experience. So anyone else, what are some other myths that we would like to dispel around OPC? I feel like Stephen covered a lot of them. Queen?
Yeah, I was gonna say Stephen definitely covered the main ones of, it encourages drug use, it brings crime to the community, it encourages drug litter. But I really just wanted to harp on some of the history that Stephen mentioned, because I think it's important to name. And also I wanted to pay homage to the people who have basically been having OPCs, like unofficial OPCs, from out of their vans, in bathrooms. Like the two that have opened in New York are the first formal official ones, but harm reductionists have been saving lives for decades, and their work has oftentimes gone unrecognized. So I just wanted to make space for that. But second, I did want to note just like how evidence-based this is. So I'm originally from New York, but I currently live in DC, and I'm organizing with other folks here in DC to open up centers, and we constantly are looking at New York. We're constantly pointing to our people here in pointing at New York, because New York is literally leading the way. And just like an example, in the first year that On Point, the two facilities were open, originally the DOH estimated that they would be able to reverse 100 overdoses in the first year. They reversed over 600 overdoses in the first year. That is around how many people we lost entirely in DC to overdose. So like, when we are saying this saves lives, like this is not like an opinion. This is very much grounded in evidence. And the lack of doing that is violence, because we are showing you what saves lives, and we're telling folks the status quo is actually like worsening situations and like also taking lives. Because what also was mentioned about how criminalization is bad for people who are struggling with co-occurring issues, we haven't talked about how criminalization in of itself worsens overdose rates. So people who are, even for a short amount of time, arrested and incarcerated, even for a few days, let alone folks who are doing longer amounts of times incarcerated, are at nearly 40 times more likely to overdose than people who are in community. And that risk is as high for the first 2 weeks of release, and that risk stays high through the first year of a person's release, not including if a person is incarcerated. So criminalization is not just bad. It's not just like a bad policy. It's like actually worsening the health crisis. And another, it's not a myth, but it's a fact about overdose prevention centers, is that another part of what is worsening our overdose crisis is the actual supply itself. So like our actual drug supply in this country is so tainted that, you know, the risk of overdose continues to increase as we see adulterants in our supply. And until we have a safe supply, which is a whole nother harm reduction mechanism that unfortunately, despite the fact that it's evidence-based, we don't have the political everything to get what we need in terms of actually regulating all substances, so people who use drugs actually know what they're using, and not having to guess, you know, what they're using. Though folks are not necessarily needing to guess if we have drug checking services, which our OPCs do have. But again, this is all harm reduction. This is how we engage people who use drugs in a non-stigmatizing way, and actually allow for folks to use and not have to risk death. And two things that I want to leave folks with before, again, passing the mic, I don't want to hog the mic too much, is that one thing I've learned from Sam Rivera, who runs On Point NYC, is also the ways that like OPCs humanize the drug use experience by also not having to wait till a person needs Narcan or naloxone to intervene in an overdose. Like in OPCs, you're able to intervene into overdoses far before a person may even need Narcan, which I think is really important, and it's more dignifying than like continuing to have to meet people who are already overdosing in the street. And second, I think one thing that policymakers and people sometimes ignore or don't recognize the importance of is love and compassion is all through the walls of OPCs. And though we can't legislate love, and some people don't recognize the strength and the power that comes in loving someone, or the consequences of not experiencing love, love is all through those walls in OPCs. And if you have not visited On Point NYC, I definitely encourage you to stop by. They're extremely friendly. They are very gracious and do tours all the time, despite the life-saving work they're constantly doing every day. But for folks who think that this is some kind of like was mentioned by Stephen, you know, some kind of just shooting dwelling place or whatever, it's not what people think of initially. It's a place of love. It's a labor of love to do that work. And it's literally how we are saving lives. And if we can expand that, you know, New York has been able to witness the life-saving, you know, consequences of opening OPCs. So it's actually just ridiculous to not expand it, especially expanding them to be 24/7. Not only expanding the number of centers, but also expanding the ability to do these services on a 24/7 basis to cover all the needs that folks may have, no matter the time or day.
Thank you so much, Queen. Thank you for adding all of that. Something you mentioned that I just want to highlight before opening up to another speaker is the concept of being able to test drugs at overdose prevention sites. But also there are local places, not just in Manhattan, but in Brooklyn and in the Bronx and Staten Island, where you can request fentanyl testing strips. You can test pretty much all drugs. There's a test for almost everything out there. So if anybody is looking for those resources, please know that the OPCs On Point NYC are resources to you, but there are resources that we can follow up with as well in Brooklyn. And even our office, for those who are NAMI-NYC members and come to our office, which is actually located on the 8th floor of the GMHC building. GMHC, they have testing strips and multiple testing strips. So whenever you come for a support group, feel free to just go downstairs and ask for testing strips, or ask one of us to connect you with some of the staff that could provide this, or that could provide Narcan and naloxone. So we just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that as a resource, and also highlighting that, you know, people have been doing this work in community long before we've had OPCs. And I know for a fact that communities always got each other's backs, community members. And I think that the concept of not using alone is really important. And the sooner, overdose is really about time, and time is of the essence. And the sooner you can see someone who might need help and get them access to CPR, an ambulance, that's the essence of time, is how you save people. And this is the last one, sorry. The Good Samaritan law, I want everybody to know about that before they get off the call. So, but more so because I want everybody to reduce the harms within our own community. I just want everybody to know that the Good Samaritan law only protects the person who is overdosing and the person who calls 911 for help. So if you all are using, or people are using in community, everybody else should scram to make sure that nobody gets into trouble, or making sure that they were trying to save somebody's life. So I just wanted to make sure that, again, everybody knows the Good Samaritan law as a mechanism of harm reduction and how we've been preventing overdose in our own communities for the past few years. Grace, I know you wanted to add something.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so I wanted to challenge, the big oppositional talking point to harm reduction, which is, I don't want my tax dollars going to fund drug use, right? Let's talk about that one. So I need to hold anyone and everyone who really stands on that belief and speaks it accountable to the fact that opposing harm reduction centers does not mean ending drug use. Like, the opposite of harm reduction is not ending drug use. The opposite of harm reduction is what we have now. So your tax dollars would continue to be spent regardless, but just as they are now. And we would continue to have the overdose deaths, the things that people complain about when it comes to drug use in their communities, So would you rather spend money ensuring that people have a space in which they're able to use what they're going to use anyway, somewhere that is clean and somewhere that, the needles and anything else will be disposed of safely? Or would you rather spend that money having needles cleaned up in your community, in your park? You know what I mean? Like, you're going to complain about that and also not support harm reduction site. And that just doesn't, you have to hold accountable to what your beliefs mean and how they actualize in real life. You don't have to. I would like you to leave with this, with an empathy for folks and for folks who use drugs, and an understanding that you have a much deeper commonality with them than you might realize. But even if I can't get you that far, I at the very least need folks to who are really, in opposition to harm reduction sites to understand that if you don't support them, that the drug use is still happening. It's just, it lives in the shadows, and things that live in the shadows perpetuate generationally and create even more harm to people and to communities. And so essentially harm reduction sites, again, you don't have to get fully on board with them after this call. I hope this starts a journey of curiosity, but there's just a flat out objective truth that going against harm reduction sites doesn't equate to ending drug addiction. It literally just means that you've chosen to reduce people's options for safety. You're choosing that people who use drugs don't deserve community, don't deserve a place where people care about them, and that they deserve to just use needles that are dirty and potentially leave them prone to illnesses and things that end up killing them, which is extremely common, that they deserve to use drugs laced with fentanyl that end up killing them. And what's really disgusting and unfortunate about thinking about people that way is that we should all know better than to speak to or even think about drug users that way. Because if you look at the statistics on who are drug users, you can't have the stigma against drug users and claim to care about people who are veterans, as so many people claim to, people who are children in the foster care system, people who end up sex trafficked, people who are victims of trauma, because these are all the primary statistical populations of folks who have, like, your likelihood of developing substance use disorder being someone of those circumstances is just astronomical. So know that you replace the word drug user with your stigma with trauma survivor. Own that. If you're going to have the stigma, carry it and go against drug users and harm reduction centers, own the fact that that's who you're really impacting, is folks in the most need, that we should be of most care and giving the most empathy towards.
Thank you so much, Grace. Stephen, did you want to add something?
No, I'm all good. I'm all good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Joshua? Yeah.
Yeah, just real quick, I'll take it from the vantage point of a treatment provider, treatment center. So it's a common misconception that OPCs are opposed to treatment centers. Like the work that we do is somehow opposed to the work they do and vice versa. And so what would it add to that is in 2019, 20.4 million people had identified substance use treatment disorder. About 10 to 15%, it's usually actually 13% is the number I see most often. So 10 to 15% of people with an identified substance use treatment disorder actually seek the treatment they need. So OPCs are more so our allies as opposed than as being opposed to us. We are working in coordination to reduce mortality rates. I mean, I think that's the goal. Everybody on this call, our goal is how do we decrease overdose rates? How do we decrease mortality rates? How do we increase engagement? So we are working in conjunction with each other and not opposed to each other at all. I appreciate all the hard work that all of our community harm reduction providers do. And it's sometimes the first step, right? It's getting them in a safe environment where they maybe can speak to somebody like, hey, I've been doing this for a while now. Maybe I would like to consider speaking to someone about treatment. But only capturing 10 to 15% out of 20.4 million. And of that 20.4 million, 1/3 have a substance use co-occurring with mental health. We're getting maybe 85% of people actually seeking the treatment they need and going to treatment. So I just want to say thank you to all the OPCs in our area to help.
That's so insightful, Joshua. Thank you so much. I think that's actually one of the common myths we do here, but that weren't mentioned before. So I'm so glad that you spoke up and added that. So now I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Alex, to talk a little bit about Safer Consumption Services Act.
Yeah, so before we go on to the policy section tonight, which I will definitely be relying on Stephen and Queen pretty heavily on, Joshua, here at NAMI-NYC, supporting the supporters and having family support within the recovery process is so important. And just piggybacking on what Queen had touched on, in your opinion, how does the role of having a family involved in somebody's recovery process and in the harm reduction process increase their chances of getting into long-term recovery?
Yeah, absolutely vital. I think it all starts with education, right? We have to educate our communities. Grace has done a great job tonight about speaking about stigma, which is where this starts, right? This is why people stay closed in. They're not seeking help. They don't feel trustworthy of government agencies, treatment providers, treatment centers, therapists, sometimes even their family, right? Because it's a lot of this stigma starts in our own families. It's that my mom or dad or uncle or brother or sister think a certain way. And in my family, we don't speak about emotions, right? Or we don't talk about trauma because you got to be tough and you got to be grounded and you don't want to, be authentic and genuine and speak about those things. You just figure that out and work hard through it, push through. It starts there. It starts within our family units. In my work day to day with families, I'm constantly educating about what recovery looks like, what treatment looks like. harm reduction centers I speak to, because sometimes I speak with families and patients and they don't come to treatment, right? And then I'm hopefully always an endless array of resources that are right here in my community. So I think it really starts with the family. And then obviously, if the person does come to treatment, the work that we do with families continues that psychoeducation component, but also we're talking communication styles, bringing the family into treatment with the patient, and then having the patient hopefully return back to a healthier system. Because one thing I've learned is that when we take a person out of a sick system and then start getting them better, and then we send them back to a sick system, they will get sick again. So I find the family role vital into all components of this. And sometimes, last thing I will say about this is that, unfortunately, sometimes families aren't healthy for us, right? And then it's for us to learn to be able to set boundaries with our family members. Sometimes the hardest thing we can do is have to cut people off, especially if it's family. Sometimes we maybe need to do that, right? For our own healing or well-being, because there may be people that no matter how amount of education and support, they may not be ready to change their points of view or perspectives. And sometimes those perspectives can be incredibly damaging and hurtful to other people.
Thank you so much for breaking that down for us, Joshua. Now, Stephen and Queen, I know that you guys work very closely in advocating for the passage of the Safer Consumption Services Act. So I would love if you guys could help me with defining what is the Safer Consumption Services Act and what will it do for New Yorkers?
You should go for it, Stephen.
Cool. Are you sure? I can.
Yeah.
So the Safer Consumption Services Act, SCSA, is the bill that would authorize overdose prevention centers across the state. Currently, the 2 overdose prevention centers that are located here in New York City, to Kimberly's point, to Washington Heights and East Harlem, they were allowed to be installed by means of an agreement between the New York City government, Department of Health, the NYPD, and community members. But because of that, OPCs are not authorized to open up anywhere else across the state, even though we are still living amongst the worst parts of an overdose crisis now, right? The reason why we are trying to pass this legislation is because our own governor, someone who has lost a family member, their nephew, to an overdose crisis, is refusing to sign and authorize OPCs across the state by means of executive order or by declaring the Department of Health commissioner to declare a health emergency. So we're really trying to push forth this legislation. And then as far as the funding goes, SCSA will also create pathways for the Department of Health to sustainably fund these OPCs across the state. And it's important to note that the Attorney General, Letitia James, by means of litigating literally big pharma in representation of the lives that were lost because of their hand in the overdose crisis, was able to litigate $3.8 billion in settlement funds, particularly earmarked for harm reduction services. So SCSA will also, like I said before, create pathways for the Department of Health to use that money and scale up the harm reduction infrastructure across the state.
Thank you so much for that, Stephen. Queen, could you add to that and say, oh, never mind, we don't have time for that. What were you gonna say?
I was just going to speak to some of the federal issues as to like the difficulties of funding OPCs. Okay, cool. So I can just go ahead with that. So there is a federal law that technically kind of bars OPCs as they are, as they operate now. It's technically called the Federal Crack House Statute, which bars, use of drugs in a place, so like authorizing that. So that's what complicates funding across the country, including in New York. having to kind of get around the federal statute just because under the last administration, there was a lawsuit that was put on Safe House, which is in Pennsylvania, where they also were trying to open up these centers. But of course, Trump interfered. And now there's just been this long-standing interference between Safe House in Pennsylvania and the federal government, the DOJ. And unfortunately, the DOJ has not, and especially this administration, has not been clear about their support or lack of support for it. So it's really been a unclear situation when it comes to whether or not the federal government will be interfering. What has been clear is that they have not interfered. Technically, like since this administration has happened, there has been no interference. The lawsuit that has been happening between Safe House happens prior to this administration. But unfortunately, Biden and his administration has not been more clear about wanting to actually fund this given the crisis. So that's been, a political kind of cover for certain elected officials to not do what needs to be done in terms of expanding OPCs, or for some people even opening one. So I think it's pretty disgraceful that New York has been literally able to witness the ways that overdose prevention centers save lives while still interfering with expanding them. So this bill, would allow for OPCs to be authorized and opened up in different places throughout the state. And it's a creative way of kind of getting around the federal, interference issue with the state. So that's what I wanted to add, that there is a federal component. And unfortunately, this administration has been more clear, despite being the first administration ever to utter the words harm reduction. They haven't actually, that hasn't really passed into how our policies are. They haven't been clear about these things.
Thank you so much for breaking that down for us. Kimberly, I pass it over to you.
You know what, Alexandra, I think we can take time to ask the follow-up question. I think it's important.
Okay, great. So follow up open to anybody. How does allowing state and city governmental funding impact the ability of the overdose prevention centers to operate and expand upon the services being offered? This is open to anybody.
I will quickly just say that the beautiful thing about OPCs is that they're actually not just about the safe use part. The safe use part is like literally one portion of what On Point does. So there's plenty of non-controversial things impacted by the federal government that need funding in these centers. And there are also private actors willing to fund safe use components. So there's a world where we can be creative and funding, the ability to have hot food and showers and the other facility or the other resources that are housed in OPCs. I mean, there's a whole holistic health component of On Point where they have acupuncture and aromatherapy. And, these are all things that need and that people who use drugs and people who are struggling with any number of issues also need. So it's kind of like a cop-out to pretend like the federal government is why we're not doing something that is literally saving lives. And it's also like the onus is on our elected officials who we literally elect to, govern our money, and put forth policies that help keep people safe and get people healthier. It's on them to creatively think about how to get around the issues that we are dealing with on the federal level with the will and the desire to actually protect our people in mind. So that's what I would say. I think there's a creative way of funding OPCs, even if the concern is the federal government, though we should address the federal government, being this interference.
Thank you so much. Stephen, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, totally. I just want to uplift Queen again for all of their work in this fight politically. I also wanted to add on that to Queen's point, the two OPCs that exist here in New York City have wraparound services from supports for housing to mental health to acupuncture and yoga. OPCs are just one layer of those services, and that layer, that area of their buildings is not funded by the city or state. It is privately funded. And unfortunately, we don't have a bunch of billionaires looking to fund harm reduction, right? Now, on top of that, like I mentioned before, there's 3.8 billion untaxed payer dollars literally earmarked towards harm reduction not being utilized, right? All the while, the state flat funded harm reduction services for the past decade at $35 million, right? For all of the naloxone, for all of the syringe service providers, everything in between at $35 million. So we, from that alone, we know that once you're able to sustainably fund harm reduction, you are in turn saving and changing lives, right? Once you're able to sustainably fund, not just by a contract, not just by pilot, but having established OPCs in areas of high need, you've seen it here in New York City, you've seen it across the world, it will save lives. And it already has since the 2 OPCs have been installed here in 2021.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And so just to round out and move forward with the conclusion of our program, I'd like to first let everybody on the call know about our support groups at NAMI-NYC. You can go to naminycmetro.org/dual, DUAL -diagnosis, and it'll pop up all our in-person and virtual support groups for people living with co-occurring substance use disorder and mental health challenges, but also support groups for family members and caregivers. So if you love someone with a mental health, with a co-occurring disorder, you too can access virtual and in-person services. Now, enough about us though. I wanna ask you all, how can community members become more involved with your respective organizations? How can we as advocates join you in this fight? I'm gonna start with Joshua.
Sure. So I will also plug our website first. So it's recoverycentersofamerica.com. And then if you do recoverycentersamerica.com/events, we actually do a lot of free webinars centered around psychoeducation on substance, but not just substance, but trauma, and many different multitude of webinars that we do. We also have alumni program that some of those events are actually open to the community and not just based for our own patients. So I think that's a good place to start with us to get more engaged. And then aside from that, I'm always just in my community promoting the work that I do personally, not only for RCA, but me. I keep my cell phone on 24 hours a day because I am here to help people struggling. So I never turn down a call, no matter the insurance or no insurance or what they're struggling with. I actually got called this weekend by a dad and the grandpa of a young adult, 15 years old, seeking a group home. They didn't know what to do. They've tried all different things. Obviously recommended some mental health stabilization first, but they were calling for assistance with hopefully getting some recommendations for a group home. So I never know where the next call is going to come from. So I will definitely make sure that my information is put in the chat. I'm always looking to partner with other amazing organizations like everyone on this call tonight, and really just grateful for the opportunity to be here and learn a lot of new things, especially about policy and procedure, and be able to share a little bit about what we do and a little bit about my story. So thank you so much. Very grateful.
Thank you, Joshua. And actually, I'm going to do a little something unorthodox. I'm actually going to ask Alexandra also, even though she's a moderator, to go ahead and plug services with Break Free and scholarships.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me this time to plug the Break Free Foundation. We provide scholarships for individuals struggling with substance use disorders and co-occurring disorders. We are formally partnered with Joshua Sewell at the Recovery Centers of America, specifically because of their co-occurring disorder program that they have at their recovery center. We're also partnered with the Realization Center, Start New York, which is in Staten Island, as well as with Recovery Centers of America for outpatient services as well. So our scholarship is for any individual that does not have the financial means to attend an inpatient and outpatient program. We're also in May launching our online support groups, which are for individuals in the queer community to come together and to talk about their substance use and co-occurring disorders. We have a general recovery group. We have an early recovery group. We also have recovery groups specifically for women and female identifying individuals and non-binary fellows who can join in on that group. And we're also offering life skills classes such as how to mend a shirt that might have a hole, how to prepare for a job interview, how to do basic budgeting. The whole goal really is to foster community. And we also have our next upcoming Break Free New York Fashion Week, which features peers and individuals in recovery, which will be on September 10th, which is World Suicide Prevention Day. We will have a live art installation where you can write on a butterfly a letter to your younger self when you were at your lowest point in your mental health, and where you can also put the name of a loved one that you lost to an overdose or suicide. And we'll hopefully have Kimberly speaking again at the showcase. Thank you so much. I will list the website for y'all to take a look. And I encourage you, if you know anybody in need of a scholarship, please, please, please feel free to reach out and fill out the form. It only takes a few moments.
Thank you so much. And I know we're running up on time, but I just want to make sure everybody has access to services. So I hope it's okay with the panelists to just stay like a couple minutes over. I'm sorry. Stephen, do you want to plug Vocal New York? How do people get involved and how can they advocate aside from joining NAMI-NYC's ambassadors? How can they advocate for the SCSA? Sorry.
You got it. You got it.
I'm
Yes.
sorry.
No, you're all good. I'm always advocating for SC, SC, at some point just become a little jumbled. But I have always loved mobilizing folks. As the drug policy campaign coordinator for Vocal, that is another chunk of my own roles and responsibilities. And just to give you guys a really quick rundown, Vocal New York stands for the Voices of Community Activists and Leaders. It is a statewide membership-led, Black-led organization fighting for the liberation of Brown and Black people and low-income New Yorkers across the state, fighting for 4 issues: ending mass incarceration, ending the war on drugs, ending homelessness, and ending HIV and AIDS. And in my role, I help build out the membership and actually mobilize power amongst drug users to eventually end this war on drug era that we're currently living in right now. So if you guys want to get plugged into the drug policy work, fighting for SCSA and all things harm reduction, I'll plug my email. We have monthly membership meetings. Our folks, we're always going up to the state capitol, the city hall, doing rallies upon rallies across the state, just to gain support around the overdose crisis that is claiming the lives of too many of our own folk. So I'll plug my email in a second. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Caitlin, could you kindly, actually, I'll do it. I'm going to put in the link in the chat and it will be followed up after in an email tomorrow or later in the week for our action to help pass the Safer Consumption Services Act. So if anybody lives in New York State, doesn't matter, you don't have to be New York City specific, it could be anywhere in New York State, please do our One Click Politics campaign to mobilize and just reinforce the work that Stephen has been doing. Queen, would you like to talk a little bit about Color Change?
Sure, yeah. So Color Change is a national racial justice organization, and I'm actually going to drop a website here called Organize For. It's a platform that we have where folks in the community can start their own petitions. So if after you're done signing everyone else's petitions, if you want to start your own for you and your community, feel free to use Organize4 to help facilitate that. But separately, I also just want to use my time to also just completely amplify Vocal. I think if you're in New York, you should be organizing with Vocal. So yeah, I'll use my time for that.
I love that.
Feeling the
Also,
love, I'm feeling the love.
Alexandra put Color of Change's website in the chat as well for anybody who wants to learn a little bit more of what they do. Grace, you want to talk about Freedom Agenda or Urban Justice or IDA?
Sure. Yeah. Quadrupling the love for Vocal. Gotta be real. And just grateful for all of this. And I learned so much, and y'all are very cool. I'm excited to stay in touch. As far as involvement, I definitely have to make a plea for Freedom Agenda. So Freedom Agenda is a member-led community organization that is at the forefront of the movement to close Rikers Island. So we're led by folks who are survivors of Rikers and incarceration, as well as those who have lost loved ones inside. And the stories are really just like unbelievable. And again, came into that through my friends who they came from the same soil and they ended up incarcerated, but we have the same shared soil of like deep generational trauma. So even if, you know, the idea of closing prisons and jails doesn't resonate with you right now, I invite you to connect with us. And maybe we can talk to you more about how what seems to be a solution is just a harm that perpetuates, and Rikers does nothing to end violence or promote community safety. It only responds to it, and it responds to it by keeping people more unsafe, making people less prepared to come back to our communities, which they ultimately do. And ultimately we spend an exorbitant amount of money every year keeping Rikers open. That really is money that we deserve for folks to have community treatment, and that's what leads to safety. Look us up online. Also follow us on all the channels of Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as at Freedom Agenda NY. I would also like to stay I'm like a 24/7 organizer, so I would love for folks to stay connected. If you're just kind of curious about anything I said or anything I talked about, like hit me up. So my name is Grace Ortez, as you see it, not Ortiz, but Ortez with an E, on Instagram, Twitter. Like, I'm always posting rallies, ways to get involved. So like, please stay in touch and just ultimately think about the stigmas that you're impacted by and how much they've hurt you. And think about how that is thrown back at you into the way you view others, and maybe dissolving that would help you approach things with a little bit more love and understanding, and ultimately make you someone that cares about saving lives above anything else.
Thank you so much, Grace. And she really means it, you guys, because literally 2 years ago, I went to a webinar that she was presenting with IDA, and I hit her up on LinkedIn right away. And I was like, what is she involved in? I need to get involved with that too. And that's how I really got involved with Freedom Agenda. That's fa.urbanjustice.org, I believe. Yeah, fa.urbanjustice.org, if anybody wants to learn more. And then, so last plug, obviously onpointnyc.org. Check that out. Check out Drug Policy Alliance in New York. Their New York State Director is Tony Smith, T-O-N-I. And we also finally, before we conclude today, I just want to echo, Robin Finkelstein is on the call. Alexandra Nyman helped moderate. We got multiple other members who all worked tirelessly on this for a while, and on the substance and on the questions. This is the first event completely put on and thought of by a subcommittee. And our subcommittee right now on dual diagnosis is small but mighty. And so if you want to join us as advocates, if you are part of the NAMI-NYC community and you live with dual diagnosis, or you love someone with a dual diagnosis, please do email us at advocacy@naminyc.org and we'll get you connected and signed up to join. But this concludes the end of our program. I'm so sad about it, but I've learned so much and I'm just so happy to stand with each of you in this fight. And I hope that by having this program, and we're going to also share the recording on YouTube and on all social media and with your respective orgs after, we hope that we were able to dispel some myths and just welcome our community again, as Grace mentioned, to be curious and stay with that curiosity. And if you need any more support or resources, do reach out. But this concludes the end of our program portion for today. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you. This was amazing.
Thank you.